In today's episode, I'll refinish and repair this old table. I got this table in a thrift store. I paid $25 for it. It was made by the Lane Furniture Company in 1970, according to the serial number on the bottom. As you can see, the finish is in really bad shape. There's lots of dark marks on the top and areas where the finish is missing completely, so I'll have to refinish it. And the legs are a bit loose, so I'll have to reglue those. I began by removing the old finish. I used a scraper for this. I get a lot of questions about my scraper. It's a 2-inch or maybe a 2.5-inch carbide blade scraper made by Husky. I'm not sure if they sell this anymore, but you can find lots of other scrapers that are basically the same thing, but made under different brand names. I also have this smaller scraper, which is also by Husky. This one has stainless steel blades as opposed to the carbide blade of the larger one. The stainless steel blade is easy to sharpen, and they even provide a file with the scraper to sharpen the blades. Whereas with the carbide blades, if you want to sharpen those, I believe you need something like a diamond stone, but you can also just buy replacement blades if you'd rather not sharpen them. I also use a utility knife blade a lot for scraping. This works really well for narrow areas like the side of this tabletop. And I also have these card scrapers and cabinet scrapers. These can also work great, but most of the time I find that the scraper with the handle is easier to use for removing a finish. I also get people asking how I avoid leaving marks in the veneer and how do I avoid scraping through the veneer. As far as leaving marks, it's really not that hard to avoid that. You can see here that the blade has a slight curve to it, so you just want to make sure not to roll the blade over to one side too much and catch the veneer with the sharp corner of the blade. And as for scraping through the veneer, that would be very difficult. You'd have to bear down really hard on the scraper to do that. I'm just applying enough pressure to remove the thin finish on top of the veneer. Before I tried scraping the finish off of the lower shelf, I removed it just by removing a few screws. Thankfully, it wasn't glued in. Before I tried removing the finish on the legs, I removed them from the tabletop. And I was going to have to do this anyway because they were loose and needed to be reglued. This was a little bit of a problem because this tabletop is made of particle board with a walnut veneer on the top. So when I pulled the legs out, some of the particle board remained stuck to the legs and was torn out. And I'm sure the sight of particle board in this video is going to bring comments from people about how much they hate particle board and how they think particle board furniture should be thrown out and isn't worth restoring or repairing. But I don't agree. I don't like particle board, and it certainly wouldn't be my choice of material to use if I was building something. But a lot of mid-century pieces do use particle board, especially on large flat surfaces like this tabletop. I feel that this table is attractive enough to save, even if there is some particle board in the construction. And one of the big drawbacks of particle board is that it's difficult to repair, and it tends to crumble like it did here when I removed the legs. But even that can be fixed. And on the subject of this tabletop and particle board, and the comments that I often see on my videos, it seems that a lot of people feel that if a piece of furniture is heavy, that means that it's made of all solid wood and or it's high quality piece. But I don't agree with that notion that weight equals quality or solid wood construction. Just take this tabletop, for instance. This top is all particle board except for a thin veneer on it, and it was very heavy. And I was curious how much it weighed, so I put it on a scale, and it came in at 15 pounds. And that's pretty heavy for a small tabletop like this. So, particle board is not necessarily a lightweight material. Most of the particle board that I've ever had to deal with was pretty heavy. Once I had removed as much finish as I could with the scraper, I sanded the rest off with a random orbital sander. And I was very careful not to apply too much pressure to the sander. You really don't need a lot. I just apply enough pressure to keep it from flying off whatever surface I'm sanding, just to keep it under control. And I also try not to move it too fast, but at the same time, you don't want to linger too long in any one area, especially on edges, because when you're dealing with veneer, you could sand through the veneer, and it's especially easy to sand through it on the edge. And thankfully, the scraping and sanding removed those dark spots that were in the top. If it hadn't, then I probably would have tried some oxalic acid to remove them. On the legs, I skipped the scraping, at least on the flat parts of the legs, and just went straight to sanding. But on the rounded edges, I used a scraper first and then sanded by hand. I didn't want to use the orbital sander on the rounded edges because it's just too easy to flatten those out with the sander. The legs were solid wood. There was no veneer. I made sure to save as many of the pieces of particle board that came off that I could, and then I glued them back in with some super glue. I didn't have all of the pieces of particle board that had been torn out, so to rebuild some of these holes, I used some epoxy putty. I first stuck a dowel into the hole that was the same size as the dowel on the leg, and then just filled in any empty areas with the epoxy. And once the epoxy dried, I could just sand it flat. The tabletop did have a small dent in it. It's a little hard to see on camera, but it's a long, narrow dent that goes across the grain. So I wanted to try and steam that out before I applied finish. To do that, I just applied some water and then took a wet rag and a hot soldering iron and applied some heat. And that worked pretty well. Once it dried out, I just had to sand it a little bit to smooth it out. Here's the legs with all the finish removed. And you can see at the bottom, there's some pretty dark staining. I assume this table probably sat in water or in a very damp place. And the bottoms of the legs got wet and it left a stain behind. First thing I tried to get rid of this was some oxalic acid. Oxalic acid works really well to remove black water stains. It doesn't always work, but I gave it a try and I just wiped it on. And I wiped it on the whole leg, not just the stain. Otherwise, if you just apply it to the stain, you might end up with a light patch there. So I let that dry for a while and came back to take a look, and it really hadn't done much of anything to the stains. They were still there. So it's possible that these stains weren't made by water, or maybe it was dirty water, or there was some kind of contaminant in it that left the stain. So I decided to move ahead with staining the legs and see if that might cover the stains. I knew I wanted to stain the whole leg because they were a lot lighter than the walnut top and lower shelf. Here I'm just wetting down the top and the leg so you can see the difference in the color, and it's pretty drastic. Before I applied stain to the legs, I glued them back together. I just had to apply some wood glue and clamp them up. There was some glue squeeze out, and I wiped away the glue on the top side with a wet rag, but I couldn't get to the glue on the underside in between the leg and the clamp, so I just left that to dry. And then I came back later once it had dried and just removed it with a chisel. So I started by using a brown dye stain on the legs, and I made this myself just by mixing some trans tint medium brown into some water. I could see that there were areas where there was glue still on the wood from when I had glued the legs back together. On this particular leg, there was a light area by the joint where I had wiped the glue off, and what probably happened is I had just smeared the glue around as opposed to actually removing it all. So the glue got into the wood and dried, which prevented the stain from being absorbed, and it left that light spot. There were also spots where it looked like maybe the glue had dripped down, or maybe I had some glue on my fingers and got it onto the leg where it dried and then prevented the stain from getting into the wood. So to fix these spots, I just took a utility knife blade and scraped away the glue. And applied some more stain. The color of the tabletop looked pretty good on its own, so I decided to first just try a clear finish on it with no stain. So I just wiped on some clear satin wipe-on oil-based polyurethane. And I did the same thing on the bottom shelf. No stain, just a clear polyurethane. Once the polyurethane had dried on the top and the lower shelf, I looked at them all together, and the legs still looked quite a bit lighter than the top and the shelf, and I could still see the stains at the bottom of the legs. And the top also looked lighter than the shelf. It's a little hard to see in this shot because the lighting's not so great, but the lower shelf is a deeper, richer color than the top and the legs. So at that point, I decided to add some more stain to the legs to get them darker and also to hopefully help cover the stains at the bottom. I couldn't sand out the stains because I'd have to remove so much material that it would change the dimensions of the leg. And I also wanted to add some stain to the top to get it a little closer to the lower shelf. So this time I used some gel stain, and the color is Candlelight, and I applied it to the legs over the polyurethane and stain that was already on there. And when I wiped it off, I tried to leave it a little bit heavy down at the bottom to help cover those stains. And this gel stain did end up covering those stains at the bottom of the legs. Once the gel stain had dried, then I added a few more coats of clear polyurethane over the gel stain. And then I could glue the legs back into the top. I decided to use epoxy for this because I wasn't sure how well regular wood glue would stick to the particle board, even though there is wood in particle board, but there's also who knows what else, probably glues or resins or something like that. And here it is, all finished. Thanks for watching.